Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Happy Thursday. My name is Eddie Copeland, and you have found the resilientchurchleadership.com webinar called The Backstage. So just want to say welcome to you. We're coming to you live, or at least I'm coming to you live from Church United here in South Florida. And if you're wondering what in the world it is that I've stumbled upon here, what is this webinar called The Backstage? It is a time where we take a little bit of time each and every week to kind of pause, to reorient our hearts and our minds as we focus on the things that we would say matter the most in ministry. We spend so much time, effort, and energy focusing on the front stage, but it really is the backstage of our lives that will always shape and qualify the front stage. So you have stumbled upon a webinar that is going to just take a little bit of time to speak about things of character, things of calling, things of soul care. And we are excited for this week's conversation. However, before we get started, I'd like you to press like and share on whatever medium you are catching this on, whether it's on Zoom, would you go ahead and just share that on Facebook, or if it's on Facebook, would you press like and share this page as we continue to get the word out about this webinar. But you are in for a treat this afternoon, because today we are joined by Dr. David Wang from Biola University. Dr. Wang is a licensed psychologist. He's a fellow pastor, an associate professor of psychology and pastoral counseling. He's also the editor of the Journal of Psychology and Theology, and is the principal investigator in a major study looking at the spiritual formation of students from when they enter into seminary and then throughout their life in ministry. And by means of no introduction, we have Dr. Margaret Diddam with us. She's a regular here on the Backstage, and Dr. Diddams is an organizational psychologist and principal consultant at the Diddams Group. And we are super excited to have both of you on as we actually talk about spiritual formation and character development in the lives of ministry leaders and pastors. That definitely seems to be a topic that has continued to gain more and more traction and momentum as the years have gone on. And Dr. Wing, I would love to start this conversation by asking you, how does character or spiritual formation connect with resiliency to you?
That's a great question. And again, thanks for having me. Really a pleasure to be part of this conversation. And as you just mentioned now in our introductions, in addition to being in academia and doing clinical work, I'm also a pastor. And ironically, what's gotten me interested in studying things like character development and spiritual formation was actually a number of really painful ministry experiences in my life when I was a pastor full time. Many of us just naturally assume that Christian education, great things like studying the Bible, studying theology, the original biblical languages, that Christian education just sort of automatically, magically cultivates character and spiritual maturity. And yet, I think many of us, myself included, are just unfortunately so profoundly familiar with pain inflicted by thoroughly religiously educated individuals who still suffer yet from some major character deficits, right? So even, back when I was experiencing some of these difficult ministry experiences, I was pondering questions such as, how can someone who knows the good so well have such a capacity to do evil and to cause hurt? And this is the question that led me from seminary to graduate school in psychology. And it's also led me to a lot of my research agenda today, which I'm thrilled to be able to share some with you. And as you all know, people have been thinking about character and virtue development for thousands of years. In fact, Rachana Kamtikar, who's the professor of philosophy at Cornell University, speaks of how contemporary virtue ethicists tend to look at virtue as this sort of harmony between what we rationally believe to be the right thing to do and our natural affections or natural desire to actually do it. And I really appreciate this idea or notion as a psychologist, because it just acknowledges this really unflattering reality in many of us, that just because we know what the right thing to do is, just because we know the good, it doesn't necessarily follow, or it doesn't necessarily imply or mean that this good is what we actually want to do, or what ultimately what we end up choosing to do. And what this tells me is that things like discipleship and spiritual formation, they can't be reduced to just a cognitive endeavor, right? You can't reduce it to just having right beliefs. And I think that's
Yeah.
a thing that is common and again, just so captured so well in your podcast, because we're here talking about the backstage. And these are definitely matters of the backstage. And the reason is because it has to encompass our affections. It has to encompass our emotions as well. And it also has to encompass our volition. Aristotle reminds us in the Nicomachean Ethics that the goal of virtuous character isn't just to know the good, but it's to actually become good.
Mm.
And Jonathan Edwards, Religious Affections, reminds us that a critical component of becoming good is to have our affections transformed and renewed in a way where the good is what we naturally love, it's what we delight in, it's what we naturally seek after, regardless of what the consequences or the final outcome of our act. So, all in all, as many of us already suspect, there is indeed a profound connection between things like character, spiritual formation, and resilience. Linda Zizeki, the chair of philosophy of religion and ethics at the University of Oklahoma, she describes intellectual virtues as forms of motivation to have cognitive contact with reality. And although here she's just speaking about the intellectual virtues, like these are virtues that have to do with good thinking and good learning, I think it's also fair to say that there's just something about character, there's something about virtue in general, and how it cultivates
Mm.
in us this broad, almost stubborn disposition towards facing or having contact with reality, whatever that reality might be, whether it involves the reality of myself,
It's
the
good.
reality of others, relationship with, or even the reality of our situations. And I know a lot of our virtues are not just intellectual, but they're also relational. And a key component of these relational virtues of relational character is my capacity to actually see and bear witness to the reality of the other, which sometimes is very complicated and very different from a lot of my own personal experience. And what I would suggest is that now, perhaps more than any other time in recent history, is this disposition to make contact with reality, this disposition to bear witness to reality. It's so crucial and critically important to resilience.
That's good. Before we just jump on, I just want to ask you to follow up on one thing that you said, and Dr. Dims, I'd love to hear your perspective on this as well. Is at last night at dinner, I was having this conversation with a major thought leader in the Christian world, and one of the comments that they made just so struck me. And it ties into something you just said, is we're graduating seminary students and we're propping up successful pastors who know a lot about prayer but don't pray or don't really know how to pray. And to me, like, it's such a we focus so much on the cognitive. Like, if we can just teach you these things, we're just going to assume that they're going to happen, and we're just going to assume that you're going to do them, and the more that you know, the more that you can impart to others. And for me, like, we're watching that doesn't create a sticky faith, but it's not forming us. It's forming my mind. It's not forming my life. And can you just speak a little bit more to that, like, both of you, please? Because I see that as just such a real problem in the life of the church today.
David, jump in, and then I have some thoughts.
Sure thing. Um, I think a lot of this goes to this perhaps implicit belief that as long as we have the right cognitions, as long as we have the right beliefs, that we can kind of sort of bypass life, so to speak, and just jump straight to this land of constant and unwavering joy and contentment and gratitude, and that this is a reflection of what the Christian life should look like.
Yeah.
When in reality, it doesn't work like that very much. We still have to live life. And even with the right beliefs, they can anchor us, but we still have to go through the chaos and the roller coaster of life. And when it comes to formation, it is actually the process of living life that forms us little bit by little bit. And and an example of this would be grief. We can understand grief we can cognitively understand the stages of grief, but when we're in the midst of grief, it's quite messy, and grief almost has a life of its own. We roll with it rather than we kind of affect. We don't shape it or change it. It actually changes and shapes us, and that's kind of the key.
That's well said.
So, David, I'd love to get your thoughts on something. About a decade ago, I did a study on character, and what I wanted to know is how does the average manager understand character? So there's lots of definitions, and as you said, in philosophy and psychology, but how does kind of the average Joe understand character? So let me start out with saying that if you go out on Google and type in character and kind of quotes, one of the quotes that's going to show up pretty regularly is that character is what you do when no one is looking. Okay, hold on to that. I hate that. And I'm going to tell you why in a second. So as I collected data from all over the country on managers of how they understood what were the characteristics of character, what showed up, as you're going to imagine, is the person is trustworthy, the person tells the truth, the person is consistent, the person knows what they're doing, these kind of attributes. And as I was thinking about what is common among them, character is how we show up to others. It's not what gets done when others are not there. It's the practice, as David was saying, of engagement with others in a consistent way. If my behavior is predictable, as it were, either good or bad, because people can have bad character as people understand it, but good character is really about relationships and consistent practice. And so to get back to the point of what you're just saying is we teach people to pray, how to pray, but not necessarily are they praying on a regular basis. And this would be interesting from David, is part of that gap, that knowing doing gap, what can be in between is shame.
Yeah.
And so, for example, some of you may resonate with this. At my church, we used to give fourth graders an IV because they made it to fourth grade. And then those Bibles would sit on their shelves for years because no one taught them how to read it. And then by the time they got to high school, they were so full of shame that they never picked up that book. And so I think part of that knowing doing gap in ministry is there's a shame of, I don't know how to do this at the level that a pastor should be doing it, right? The uber expectations, and yet then the shame kind of puts the brake on it. So I, in a sense, am hiding from myself.
That's really good.
So David, I just throw those two ideas out there for you.
Yeah, and one of my reactions and reflections from what you shared is that the research on prayer actually suggests that that Christians and Christian leaders will tend to engage in petitionary prayer, or prayer that tends to be more petitionary, more transactional towards the earlier stages of their spiritual development. But over time, they begin to, they don't ever stop doing petitionary prayer, but they start evolving into more of a contemplative frame when they pray. And I think this kind of fits into this larger theme of relationality that you talked about, where perhaps our faith starts off as a little bit more transactional, and from there it moves towards relationality. And ultimately, I believe it's through this relationality in prayer, at least in our relationship with God, that is that critical element that shapes and transforms us into his likeness. In fact, there's research that's found that for those who kind of stubbornly cling to petitionary prayer when they're going through a difficult time, it actually contributes to a feeling of hopelessness and spiritual doubt and spiritual struggle. So especially when we're in the midst of struggle, what we need is not a transaction. We really need someone to accompany us into that.
Can you park just a little bit of time here for a second? Because one of the things that just jumped to my head is I've been having a lot of conversations with pastors lately around the pandemic has exposed the transactional nature that we have pitched salvation as. So when you pitch salvation as a transaction between me and God, as a get out of jail free card, or just pray the prayer and you're good, not only does that not create a stickiness in your faith and in your discipleship, the moment that you face adversity, like God's not holding up his end of the bargain, rather than pitching from the very beginning that what is salvation actually for? It's for the life and flourishing of the world that starts with your own flourishing, your own life-giving sense. And I think that that's been lost somewhere along the way, that's contributing to even the problem that we're talking about today. Did you agree with that? Or I'm just curious, like how does that resonate with you?
It resonates really well. And I feel like, again, looking at it from a spiritual developmental perspective, many of us start off in the faith from kind of a transactional frame again, that's really tied to outcomes. So it's kind of like, well, if I were to ask the question, what is your fundamental motivation for following Jesus? A lot of people might answer and say, well, it's because my faith works. When I do this and when I trust in God, then I'm going to get the outcome that I desire, whatever that outcome might be. And I think that's still part of the testimony of Scripture. It's part of our faith.
Sure.
But the only thing we have. And this is where character fits in, because especially later on in the spiritual journey, as we see in the life of Christ, it's quite common for us to do exactly what God wants us to do, and for the outcome and the situation objectively to go from bad to worse. So a lot of times the world is unjust and chaotic, and doing the right thing actually leads to the worst outcome. So then in that kind of situation, you have to again ask the question, well, what is my motivation to do the good if it can't be tied to an outcome? And the answer is character. The answer is character and virtue.
So
Good.
David, with when you're working with seminary students, is there a point at like a tipping point where they make that shift from transactional to more relational, or how does that happen?
Yeah. Well, in the large grant that I'm working on, we have about 1,000 seminary students participating from 18 different seminaries. It's an ecumenical study. We're finding, and we're only in 9.3 in our data collection thus far. So we've analyzed some of the data from our time point 1, which is the first semester, of entering seminary students. And we found that the vast majority of seminary students entering into seminary, they fit this kind of profile where they just want to make other people happy. They're oriented towards, what psychologists call impression management. They want to put on a good show. They want to fulfill other people's expectations. And I think it's coming from a good heart. It's not like they're, narcissistic necessarily, but they just want to make people happy and want to serve people, right? And as a result, and part of this profile empirically is that they are uncomfortable with things like ambiguity. They're uncomfortable with mystery. They are highly ashamed. They endorse a lot of shame. They're fundamentally fairly afraid of God and his punishment. And they're almost afraid that they're going to get caught, So what this tells a psychologist is that perhaps they haven't gone to the place where they're really in touch with the full reality of themselves. And so that presents an interesting challenge for those of us in seminary and in theological education. Like, what do we do? How do we steward these students, these gifts that the Lord has given us? And how do we accompany them through this journey of self-knowledge and self-awareness?
I think No. I just like why this is problematic as I'm hearing you talk about this, and I kind of put the lens through the church today. Is I remember a professor in graduate school in one of my counseling classes shared, you can only take someone in the counseling room as far as you've been willing to go yourself. And when you use that principle into what you're talking about here in the life of a seminary student, that creates a problem in the life of the church.
So David, in organizational psychology, we talk about the imposter syndrome. And this sounds like exactly for new seminarians that that's what's popping up. So how do seminaries, how do we work with pastors to move them beyond that imposter syndrome?
I think the first stage is kind of what this idea that Eddie was just sharing, that we can only go as far as the student or individual is willing to go. And I have taught courses on spiritual formation, have been part of classes that have emphasized spiritual formation. And I've seen it happen where you have a really well-intended professor or instructor just with such great excitement and urgency, just share and teach all that this person knows about formation. And it's almost like they're force feeding everyone, student, into going here and into knowing themselves. And invariably, some students are going to, soak it all in and it's going to be great. And other students are going to be resistant. And I found that for those students who are resistant, we need to respect that. If we force someone to go somewhere they're not willing, it's going to be counterproductive. And how this relates to perhaps our own formation as the teachers and instructors, I think a lot of it has to do with accepting our own limitations. Like, I cannot change fundamentally everyone that comes my way. The best I can do is perhaps identify those who are ready, those who need it, those who are willing, and then I can accompany them through that process.
So let's take a lot of what we've been talking about, and if I'm going to sit in the chair of a pastor or a ministry leader today, and let's say that I'm hiring someone for my team, a lot of what we've been conditioned to believe, and I would argue in a lot of what's out there in terms of like bestsellers in terms of Christian leadership, would emphasize, and I've had a major denominational leader actually tell me this, which I think I've referenced on the show before, is give me a capital L gifted leader and I can work on character later. Like, we can work on character development as part of the journey, but I want a jet fuel drinking, let's go take the hill for Jesus, like super gifted communicator. And what I'm hearing both of you say is like, actually, it's the opposite. Like, the character piece has to come first and we can actually work on everything else.
And David, what do you say?
Margaret, why don't you jump in first?
Okay. Well, as David's been talking about, character is really a practice. And it's something that, think about any of you who play musical instruments. To get good, you have to practice to the point that it becomes second nature. So we want to think about character in terms of second nature in how we interact with people. And that's a lifelong journey. So I don't really think that you can say, I want to just bring me someone who has certain skills and then I can teach them character. I will say this, in my own study that I did, that a lot of managers said that being competent was a characteristic of character. So just what that leader was saying, I'm going to bifurcate competence and character. And actually, one way that you can think about character is critical thinking skills, seeing the forest for the trees.
That's a great point.
And so the idea that you somehow can bifurcate this and that one kind of mitigates the other is a really bad way to think about character. Character is ingrained in who we are. One of the things I would say is that people are people of character. Mm-hmm. Now, it's whether it's good or bad, but people have practices. People have practices of virtue. It might not be good virtue. So people are going to bring character to any situation. We want to make sure that there's a maturity in that consistency and virtue ethics. That's part of what people are bringing. People bring character. It's just a question of what.
So a common question then would be, and I'd love for you to follow up on this, is so how can a pastor actually grow their own character? Because that's not really a frame that we would hear often. Like, I can grow in my leadership, I can grow in my preaching. But like, when we talk about growing in character, how do you do that?
gonna let David, I have some ideas, but I did the last talk.
I'll take a quick stab at this. I think character, when we, usually the frame that we work with, even in seminary and theological education, is this, we have this orientation where we're the subject and something else is the object. Even the Word of God, it's where we're kind of properly handling the Word of God. But when it comes to formation in our spiritual life, formation of our character, it's just the opposite. We're not the subject. We're actually the object, And so it's perhaps it's not kind of own character, but rather, are we going to not stand in the way? Are we going to participate in life in the Lord, in other in my own process of being shaped into character and into the likeness of Christ? One of the things that we find in research on character is that it takes a lot of time, so character isn't one of those things that we can just shape within a couple days, within the context of a few decisions that we make. It's almost like you're digging a new ditch through your brain, and the only way you can dig a ditch is one shovel at a time. So there's kind of a consistency to that. So we have to be patient with it. We can't speed up the process, but we sure as heck can do a lot to slow down that process.
Yeah. Dr. Diddams, what would you add to that?
So I want to recommend one of the books that we'll put on the show title by James K.A. Smith, You Are What You Love.
Great. That's a great book.
It is a great book about developing practices. I had a situation where a manager was saying to me about his manager is, I just don't know where he stands on this topic. I think one of the things for people to think about in developing character is, am I consistent? Can people rely on me? What am I doing in
super practical,
working
That's
with
really
others? So they're pretty much going to know what my response is going to be. I used to joke with my own team that if they could parody me, that was a sign of character, because they knew what to expect. So if your folks can parody you, that's because there's that level of consistency. So I think when we think about working on character, it is, what are the practices that I want to be known for, so that people know that they can count on me.
That's really helpful, and that's really practical. Yeah. Wow. Dr. Diddams, actually, before we move on to a next topic here, you and I have talked a lot in previous shows about the role that soul care, caring for ourselves, focusing on the backstage, that actually plays a key part of resiliency in ministry. I would love to just get your take on, how do pastors and ministry leaders often, for good and for bad, over-spiritualize or under-spiritualize resiliency in ministry?
Yeah, so David can jump in here. One of the things I talked about maybe a couple weeks ago was the difference between resiliency and grit. And a lot of people have read Angela Duckworth's fabulous work on grit, and that's that stick-to-itness. Resiliency in psychology has a little bit of a different take, in that it's bouncing back better from some dip. And we're certainly in that trough right now. So I think for both over spiritualizing and under spiritualizing, while we're kind of in that trough, is on the over spiritualizing side, is going too quickly to the notion of all things work together for good for those who love the Lord, and that I'm looking for the quick, not necessarily quick, but I'm looking for an answer now of how the Lord is going to use this time in my life, in the life of my team, in the life of my congregants. And so that over spiritualizing is, I want that quick answer now. This goes to what David was talking about transaction. Okay, God, I'm willing to put up with COVID, but you have to give me something in return, right? That's that kind of over spiritualizing. And then the under spiritualizing is, I think, the gutting it out. It's almost like the Angela Duckworth, well, I'm not going to acknowledge that my world is turned upside down. It's imperative for me to keep going. And as David talked about in the brain, you create ruts in your brain. You actually get fairly narrow thinking when you're under high levels of stress. And so what happens in kind of the under spiritualizing is in a sense, I'm not relying on God, I'm relying on myself, but to the glory of God. So on the one hand, on the over spiritualizing, I'm trying to get God to give me something. On the under spiritualizing, I'm kind of have God at the side here watching me, like try to gut through and win God's approval that way. So I think that under spiritualizing, over spiritualizing, we have to think about where we fall in that, and both are transactional, right?
Yeah.
Both are transactional. What I want from God, kind of the over spiritualizing, what I think I need to give to God on the under spiritualizing. And as David was talking earlier, we lose the relational aspect of character.
Those are actually
two. God.
No, I was also going to say, like, to me, at least, it's that those are two very individualistic approaches too.
Right.
Like it misses the larger thing that God's doing in my church, in my family, in my life, and literally just makes it all about me, what I want from God, or what I want to do for God. Sounds soul crushing.
That's the irony, right, of over spiritualizing something, is I've actually made it about myself. I haven't made it about God. So
one of the things, go ahead, please.
One of the common themes in both over spiritualizing as well as under spiritualizing, again, taking it back to some of the stuff we talked about earlier, is that it takes us further away from reality, right? Because oftentimes with either of those approaches, we start off and we take this complicated and nuanced situation, and then we end up oversimplifying it, into some kind of resolution that involves some kind of cognition or belief, or me just kind of grinning and bearing it.
Or a 3-point sermon.
Yeah, exactly. And again, this idea of like, as long as I believe and I know the good, or I do the good, that my situation, no matter how legitimately challenging, multifaceted, nuanced it might be, I can skip all this life, I can skip all this reality, just again, go to that joy and contentment, and also expect that the final outcome is going to work out perfectly. And when this formula fails, and trust me, it inevitably will fail, a lot of times people will just naturally internalize this in the form of shame. So instead of like things not working out well because we're in a situation that's outside of our control, it's very tragic, it's very complicated, I will end up internalizing and even simplifying the interpretation and kind of make it about something wrong about me. Like maybe I didn't work hard enough, maybe I didn't have enough faith, maybe I didn't trust you enough, without really just taking a step back and questioning the whole premise.
Yeah, that's so good. Friends, before we move on, I do want to take this time to say, if you have a question on anything that you've heard so far, or anything that you will hear in our last 30 minutes here, please put that in the chat here on Zoom or in the comment section on Facebook, and we'll be sure to get to your questions. Margaret, one of the things that just jumped to mind is you and I were having a side conversation some time ago talking about resiliency in ministry. And one of us said something to the account of, a lot of times we view resiliency in the church as I'm still standing, right? Like I've been through it, I'm here, I've been resilient. And we think that that's what resiliency is. But when we actually kind of get honest with ourselves and look back at like the carnage that's caused my family, the bodies along the way, the disillusionment and the pain of my own soul, but I can tell you I'm still here and God's still good and look what he's done. That's actually maybe the opposite of what resiliency in ministry is. And I would love for you to just unpack a little bit of that, David, as well. But like, how would you both define, since this is a project of resilient church leadership, what does resiliency in ministry look like?
I'm going to talk real quick and then I'm going to hand it over to David. I think in looking at the psychological literature alone is that when we are being resilient, there's some sort of pivot in that we get to the point where we can no longer live the lives that we're living. And in order, we recognize that we're not flourishing. And in order to flourish, we recognize that we need to pivot. And that's different than gutting it out. And that's, if anyone wants to go back, I'll log roll a little bit. We did a show a little bit about lament and resiliency. There appears to need to be some sort of pause where I can take stock of what's going on and enter into this time of recognition that what's working in the past really is not working now, and that I have to change. And it's a wholesale change. It's not just something around the edges. So resilience is really an incredible concept when we think about it in that way. And to me, it's more powerful than grit or gutting through, because it's allowing God to shape us. Finally, this is the letting go.
That's the key.
About me. When I'm ready to say, God, me as the center of my life, it is not working, or how I've done things is not working. Lord, I leave it to you to help me to rebuild this.
It's good.
David?
Yeah, and just kind of dovetailing with what you just shared, resilience, one way to look at it is a person's capacity to recover or bounce back from challenging situations. And just inherent in this language of recovering and bouncing back, that implies that there's actually an initial dip, so part of the process of resilience is that you have to go through that initial period of struggle. And a lot of times it's that period of struggle, like Margaret so helpfully articulated earlier, that's where some of our false selves become deconstructed. They're no longer viable. And I have to mature and look elsewhere and be different and take a different approach to life. So when we look at recovering and bouncing back, it's almost like a redefining of who we are. And that's where a lot of the growth comes from. And that's where a lot of times, it doesn't happen all the time, but when people talk about post-traumatic growth, it is possible to actually grow through a difficult circumstance.
Dr. Wang, one of the things that we've done here in South Florida is we've had a large emphasis on soul care and believing that as we invest in leaders under the waterline, that's actually kind of one of the secret ingredients to sustained collaborative gospel movement in a region. And that affords me a lot of conversations with pastors. And one of the things that I've heard every time we talk about spiritual formation, or the lack of spiritual formation in their own lives, in my life, in the life of the church, one of the themes that keeps coming back over and over and over again is, in their own way, through the lines, what each one of these leaders is saying, indeed, even what I've said is, in order for me to really enter into a spiritually formative process, I'm going to have to undo the things that I'm currently selling to the church week in and week out. I'm going to have to change a lot of my programming, because everything that I'm doing, if I'm really honest, is actually very programmatized. Believe this, do this, memorize this. It's cognitive. We don't know how to do spiritual formation. One of the things that I've heard you say before is, and I'm going to say this lightly, I don't say this lightly, is ministry as we know it can actually be harmful or work against our own spiritual formation. And I've seen that time and time and time again. And I think a lot of us feel stuck. Like, what do we do? Like, we don't want to, I'm a local church guy. I believe the church is the hope of the world. So I don't want to burn it down. But I completely think something's got to give. Something's got to change, because I see a lot of tired, disillusioned, and I'd even say spiritually abused souls out there.
I'm with you, Eddie. And I feel like what we're dealing with, there's not a quick fix to it. It's a systemic issue where to go on that spiritual journey oftentimes means that I'm going against the grain of the church culture. I'm going against the grain of expectations that everyone has on me as a pastor. I'm going against the grain of perhaps even the expectations that I have for myself. And it's a very lonely, journey. And one of the things that might be most helpful in facilitating that journey is a sense of relational safety with just a few people. If you don't need to have that kind of relationship with everyone, but it makes a world of a difference between having no one in the world where you can just be yourself, and for you to be held as yourself versus one or two. And sometimes that just having one or two is more than enough for us to start that journey and to have permission to continue in it, even when unfortunately many other well-intended believers and Christians don't quite understand what you're doing and might be even concerned about where you're heading.
Yeah. Dr. Diddums, how do you interact with that?
Well, David, as you were talking, I was thinking kind of inoculation is like if pastors are feeling this disconnect in authenticity and not addressing it, there you can address it in a way when you first recognize it with others in relationship. But if you don't, you're going to crash and burn. And so this is kind of like the slow burn, the backfire, the deal with it now while you realize it. Because if you just keep shutting it off, you're just not going to get out of bed one morning. And so this is hard work to come to the point where you say to yourself, something's got to give, something's got to change. But if you just gut through it, the body keeps the score. You can't trick your body under years of stress. It will break down. And so better to deal with it when it's on a slow flame than when it's just you get to the burnout.
Yeah. One of the things that we often, I think, confuse in Christendom, and Dr. Wang, you've actually spoken about this a lot before, that pastors really have a hard time with this concept of God's will for their life, God's will for their church, God's will for their calling. And as I was reading some of the things that you've said about that, it reminded me of that old book by Bruce Waltke, Finding the Will of God, a Pagan Notion, and how Dr. Waltke argues that like there's no such thing as the special will of God in your life. Like the Bible doesn't actually teach that. And no matter where you stand on if you agree or disagree with that, this whole idea of chasing the will of God in my life has led to a lot of hiding, to a lot of shame, to a lot of pretending. And I would just love if you could speak a little bit to that.
Yes, great question. And I think inherent in that belief of kind of this, will of God that we're pursuing is again a very pragmatic consideration. Like if I just get this right, everyone's going to be happy, the end result's going to be great, and our church is going to grow, and it's going to be validated by outward success, And again, when we get further in the spiritual journey, following Jesus is less and less validated by outward success. And we have to find a different way, a different motivation to move forward. And I think part of that is character, and a big part of that is character and virtue. But this introduces this tension between, well, what are my affections in desiring or in love with the most? Is it actually God, or and the good, or is it this outcome that I've always wanted?
Yeah, that's good.
I found that in reality. I mean, even from college ministry, and you see this all the time with younger believers who are thinking about dating each other, and then inevitably you get into this moment of like, hey, we're just praying whether or not it's God's will for us to date each other. Practically, I've never encountered a couple that actually did that process and found that
so true.
not for them, they inevitably kind of go, yes, but in reality, it's probably I'm not sure, but we're going to kind of try this anyway.
Yeah.
And sometimes God does supernaturally intervene, and in several occasions in my life, a few occasions on my life, I did receive a very clear kind of sense of direction, and those were in areas of life that were kind of shaped the trajectory of the direction of my life. But in my own personal experience, the vast majority of cases, there's almost this sense of vagueness when I come before God about the will of God. And I think part of that is the human condition of, one day, right now we see as if through a mirror, but when we're with God in heaven, we'll see face to face. I think that's part of it. But I think part of it is also, it might relate to virtue and the cultivation of wisdom, that God wants us to be shaped in our affections, in our love, where we naturally choose out of our own heart. Like I think it was St. Augustine. I think I might be quoting this wrong, but love God and do what you love.
Yeah. No, I remember I had a mentor in life, and like we were deciding if we're going to move cross country. I had an opportunity to go do something, and I had this opportunity in one hand and this opportunity on the other. And I remember kind of wrestling through this. This was very early on in ministry, and I'm like, which one do you think God's will is? And this mentor wisely looked at me and goes, well, both. And I was completely like, what do you mean that can't be, that can't be the case? And he just kind of undid just years and years and years of just awful thinking, much along the lines of what you're sharing. And I've just never forgotten that moment of, man, like I have viewed God wrong. I have viewed what he wants for me wrong. And it's just been super pragmatic, reductionistic. Like I can keep going. But yeah, very practical. And it's led to a lot of unrealistic expectations, both that I put on myself and both that I also put on God when we view God as transactional in that way.
A resource. My dear colleague, Doug Koskela at Seattle Pacific University has written a book about God's calling on our lives. And the way he describes it is three ways: is a general call, like we know what we're supposed to do as citizens and believers, and then missional call, which is linked to our gifts and graces, and then direct call. And as Doug points out, direct call, that's the burning bush, whatever. Direct calls happen, but they're rare. And one of the things Doug likes to say is, you'll notice in the Bible, whenever there's a direct call, you're called to suffer. So don't be
we
so
don't like hearing that. I don't like hearing that, if I'm honest.
Don't be so anxious for that direct call. But what if we said, I'm going to be faithful in this missional and general, and I'm going to know when I get a direct call, but it's perfectly fine to live in that missional space.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I was just reminded as you're talking how many times the Bible speaks to the idea of just live an ordinary and quiet life, love God, love people. And I think in the West, we've tended to view it, we need to all like we're world changers, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And I think that speaks to someone's very direct call, and that does happen. We've seen that in time and time again. But in general, it's endeavor to live a quiet life, love God, work hard, love your neighbor as yourself, and let the Lord form you as you demonstrate his kingdom.
Yeah, it is not a spiritual deficit to not have a direct call.
Come on.
I just used
that's so good
there, but it's really important in spiritual formation to not feel a loss if you're not having a direct call, just living in that.
Or that I'm less than.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Hey, we actually got a question from the audience here. Is how, as you study leaders and teams, what's a healthy way to address the unrealistic expectation pastors and ministry leaders face? And a follow-up to that is, how do pastors get out of that trap? Dr. Wang, we want to take a stab at that, or Margaret, anybody? Yeah.
Sure. And I think a good starting point is, again, this notion of grief and coming to terms with the reality of myself, and to come to accept that we're not superhuman. I can't live up to everybody's expectations. and to pursue freedom from internalizing this expectations from these external expectations, and make them our own. And I think that's I know it could be a bit trite to mention that, but that journey of grief is a journey of not only recognizing our own limitations, but ultimately finding a home in ourselves, and making that home, inviting God into that home.
I like that. I like that frame too. Just finding a home in ourselves. I like that.
I hate to add onto that. Let me say one thing is I didn't realize I had been doing it for years, but when I disagreed with someone, or someone was pushing me in a way that I didn't think was appropriate, if it was through an email, I found that I would always start my email with "thank you." So thank you, whomever, for your thoughts on this. And a joke started that if you got an email from Margaret that started with "thank you," it's not good. But I didn't mean that. I was actually trying to start the conversation of disagreement with engagement. And so this is a really wonderful question. It's really broad, something for us to think about it, doing an entire show on. But when you have that in engagement, that the expectations are different than what you're expecting, to start the conversation in engagement rather than defensiveness or in different corners becomes really important.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm just kidding. I'm just joking.
Thank you, Margaret.
No. Hey, speaking of starting from different corners, if we can just pivot to something that I think is on all of our minds right now, is, guys, let's be honest. We are about to head into a week where we have people in our pews who are on very different corners of the political spectrum. And this is no doubt going to be, I would probably argue, one of the most challenging weeks and then coming weeks for pastors and for church leaders. In fact, we're doing our whole show next week on how do you pastor a divided flock. But while I have both of you on here and just our last kind of 8 minutes together, would you just be able to just share some pastoral wisdom or some counsel on what would you say to pastors and church leaders going into this week as they no doubt prepare to pastor a very divided flock? Dr. Wang, you were even sharing before the show that you're actually in your counseling work counseling couples who are literally splitting up over political differences and the cascading effects that's happening. I mean, I've talked to pastor after pastor who just is tired, and this is causing tremendous burnout and saying, like, I'm done. This isn't what I signed up for. What bits of counsel or wisdom do you have to share?
And I'm seeing both in my clinical practice, not only the couples that are in the process of separating because of political differences, but also those pastors that are burned out because they don't know how to reconcile a very fragmented country and a very fragmented congregation. And just in those couples, with those couples that I work with, I'm just finding that it goes. Even the political differences, it starts with it, but those are really the entry points into a more profound kind of schism or need for repair and reconciliation. It's really just the tip of the iceberg. And my first encouragement for everyone is just to validate and this idea that this is a profound challenge that isn't going to, you're not going to have a quick fix for it. And in many of the church systems that I've been familiar with over my life, I found that it's quite often for church cultures to be fairly conflict avoidant, where, a lot of times the course of action that they will choose is the one that angers the least amount of people,
Yeah.
And in the process of doing that, it's often the case where because we are conflict avoidant, we often just settle for this surface level peace. You know, as long as people are still showing up on Sundays, as long as they kind of get along, even though they don't really talk and don't really understand each other, that's kind of good enough for me. And I think that just stands in contrast to this biblical notion of shalom, which is this deeper sense of relational harmony, where we may not necessarily agree with each other. We may not necessarily come from the same background or see the world in the same way, but because we're believers in Christ, we're still in community with each other, and we're still committed to facing and encountering each other's reality as well as our shared reality. So I think my encouragement is, reconciliation and repair. This very well might be the primary work of our churches in 2021. And pastoral care, and even more than the traditional kind of ministry activities and the economy and heart.
I completely agree with you.
This is really that work, and we can't cheapen that work. We have to go into it with a long-term mindset of, hey, we need to establish shalom, and it's going to be a messy process. So kind of, put on the seatbelt and, get ready for the ride.
Yeah. Dr. Diddams, what about you?
I think David has absolutely summed it up. I really like, David, that idea of saying the rest of this year, 2021. I mean, we're seeing it all through the coronavirus pandemic, is eyes opening in a different way that now allows for reconciliation. And so for pastors to be upfront about being, what does it mean to be a peacemaker? When we read that in the Sermon on the Mount, because it's everyone's job, and to put it front and center rather than to kind of smooth it over. I think pastors are going to have to put their arms around, if that's possible, figuratively or literally, some of their congregants, and say, we need to be in the body. We need to be in the body, because we're all seeing issues with our brothers and sisters in Christ who, and this goes back, David, to what we were talking about earlier, about virtue and character, about focusing on only the virtues that are in the mind, as it were, and avoiding the ones that are relational. And as the body of Christ, we need
so true. Yeah, I think as a pastor too, this election season presents a rare opportunity for some unique vulnerability from the pulpit and to your people, and just to share that this is difficult for you. This is difficult for us, and that creates almost a normalization of, okay, like this is hard for him too, right? This is hard to pastor into this season. There are landmines everywhere, but I think the more real we are with our people, the more we open up, like I don't have this figured out, you don't have this figured out, and we can go on this journey of reconciliation and authentic conversation and honesty together, rather than I'm just going to retreat and let's not say anything. And I also think, as someone, we spend a lot of time, as someone who leads a unity movement here in South Florida, now is a time to fight for church unity, to fight for unity within our own local churches, but also in the broader bride of Christ. Because I think in an increasingly divisive world, the unity of the church becomes one of the greatest apologetics we can offer to our unsaved friends and neighbors. We need to instill a countercultural narrative in this time. And the church is the only institution in the world where a Republican and a Democrat, a black man and a white man, or a black woman and a white woman can come together and share nothing in common but Jesus Christ, and then go on a journey from there. And we cannot lose that. So that's my take, at least. In our last 2 minutes here, we always go around and give each of you a final word on the topic of the day. And as we've been talking about character and spiritual formation, I'd love to hear Dr. Wang and then Dr. Diddams, just like one final thought on why this character formation, spiritual formation and character matter more than our front stage? Essentially, why does our backstage matter more than our front stage? Final word.
My final word is just gonna to talk about this again, the tension of the front stage and the backstage. I think Dietrich Bonhoeffer articulates this really well in Life Together when he talks about this tension between our spirituality and community and our spirituality and solitude. And he says this: "Let him who cannot be alone be aware of beware of community. Let him who is not in community beware of being alone. Each by itself has profound pitfalls and perils. One who wants fellowship without solitude plunges into the void of words and feelings, and the one who seeks solitude without fellowship perishes in the abyss of vanity, self-infatuation, and despair." And friends, many of us have found a home for our spiritual life in our spiritual communities, and rightly so. But during this time of COVID-19, we, whether we like it or not, must pivot towards not only finding a home for our spiritual life in community, but also finding a home for our spiritual life in solitude before God. And as we talked about that trajectory of resilience, where there's the initial dip and deconstruction, and then the recovery of reconstruction, I believe that if we're able to find our homes spiritually in solitude during this season, when we emerge from this season, I suspect that we will find a newfound richness in our spiritual community that we wouldn't have been able to attain had we not gone through this problem.
Dr. Didham's final word.
I can't follow that up. That was marvelous, and we're going to post that clip on the page. I would just add more simply, as I ask those who are tuned in to today and who might follow up and watch this, how will you practice character this week to others, and how will you practice it in your own life in that solitude?
That's good. Well, hey friends, we're right at our time. I just want to say thank you so much to you both for leaning in. I know we've referenced a lot of books, a lot of articles. If you're listening to this, please will be posted at resilientchurchleadership.com, where you can find all those articles and resources. I'm Eddie Copeland. It's been a pleasure to be joined by Dr. David Wang and Dr. Margaret Didhams. We will see you next week, as I'll be joined by Dr. Ed Stetzer and Mindy Calguire as we talk about shepherding a divided flock. Thank you so much for making time for this. Please remember to like, share, and share this resource with your friends, and visit resilientchurchleadership.com. We'll see you next week. Thank you so much to you both.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.